Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Hello, everybody. Happy Sunday. Thank you for being here tonight. We're getting started. Thank you. So welcome to the Left Forum 2019 Closing Plenary. The theme for tonight's plenary is what is left to be done? And we have some great speakers here who will address this question. You will hear more about the speakers in a little while. But first, I'd like to thank those who made tonight possible. St. Francis College staff and community, thank you for welcoming us to your institution. As an alumni of this fantastic college, it brings me great pleasure and pride to bring an event that is so dear to my heart to this wonderful place full of great memories, so thank you. This conference is so special because of you, the people here tonight, and your consistent support and contributions. Thank you for being present. It is appreciated very deeply. I understand that for many of you, there were some sacrifices that had to be made because we pulled this together in a very short time. I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Thank you. Yes. So I'll just repeat that. I said this conference is very special because of you, the people here tonight. Your support and your contributions, they matter so much, and they make this conference what it is. So thank you for being present. It is appreciated very deeply. I'd like to thank all the participants of this conference, the panelists, exhibitors, the media, our plenary speakers, my colleagues on the board of directors, and other members of the Left Forum community. Thanks. But most importantly, I'd like to thank the volunteers and staff. None of this would have been possible without you. I'm just gonna introduce you to some of these people who I'm sure you're familiar with by now. You may have exchanged quite a few emails with them in the past few weeks. Ashley Abbott, the event director. Matt Benetti, another member of our staff. Alan Schulman, volunteer extraordinaire. Marcus Grech, who I'm sure most of you know. Chris Harding, Michael Lightsmith, Laurie Bogath, Teresa Eddins, Zachary Rosen, Connor Tomas, and the rest of the wonderful volunteer team who worked tirelessly to realize this conference. Your sacrifices, hard work, genius, and camaraderie are such a gift, and I'm honored to be among you. Thank you very much. So I will now, thank you. I will now pass the mic to the moderator for the evening, Kazembe Balagun. Thank you very much and enjoy the plenary.
Can you guys hear me? Good evening, and happy Sunday, and I guess I would say happy Pride. My name is Kazembe Balagun. I am currently serve as a project director for the Rosa Luxemburg, project manager for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York office. I'm also an activist, and I'm also very happy to be here at the Left Forum. The Left Forum has a long history, as Stan mentioned, for about 14 years of being a place of intellectual engagement where people learn, conspire, and inspire with each other. And certainly it's very good to have this first Left Forum here in Brooklyn, which has historically been a borough of people's movements. You're thinking about movements for democracy, for housing justice, for educational justice, and for racial justice. Brooklyn has been where it's at, and y'all are truly part of the People's Republic of Brooklyn. So thank you all so very much. Right on. I'm not gonna say too much in terms of introductions because I feel that it's we have such a I don't even know. I feel like I'm on the NBA All-Star team. I mean, I've left intellectuals, and so it's like, but certainly the question that Sam laid out, what is left to be done, is a question that has been framed for this particular conference. Certainly, kind of inspired by certainly from the work of Lenin, his famous track "What Is to Be Done," but certainly kind of coming through this kind of question that we're kind of putting forward tonight in this particular time of deep existential crisis that we're facing in terms of what kind of world do we want to live in. Certainly the crisis around climate, the crisis around migration, the crisis around economic inequality, the crisis around gender equality, all is framed into what is left to be done. And I think the question is also putting forward, in the middle of this crisis, how can we rescue from this crisis opportunity and a chance for a new world? And so this is what has been tasked tonight for our speakers. Specifically these questions, which are looking at a time when alternatives and options have been exhausted, what types of progressive and radical responses are possible and can be proposed, and what can we learn from past and current struggles and traditions moving forward. And so this is what has been tasked with our fine panelists, who I'm going to introduce by the order with their speaking. To my left and your right is David Harvey. David Harvey is a leading theorist in the field of urban studies, whom the Library Journal called one of the most influential geographers of the late 20th, I'm going to correct this, the most influential geographer of the 21st century. And David Harvey earned a PhD from Cambridge University and was formerly the professor of geography at Johns Hopkins, and is currently still professor at City University of New York. And his latest book is called Rebel Cities, From the Right to the City to Urban Revolution. He'll be followed by, on my far right, yeah, please give it up, you feel free. He'll be followed by Kali Akuno. Kali is a co-founder and director of Cooperation Jackson. He served as director of special projects and external funding in the mayoral administration of the late Chokwe Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi. And his primary focus is supporting cooperative development, the introduction of eco-friendly and carbon reduction methods of operation, and the promotion of human rights and international relations for the city. He has served as co-director of U.S. Human Rights Network, the executive director of the People's Hurricane Relief Fund based in New Orleans, Louisiana, after Hurricane Katrina, and he's one of the co-founders of the School of Social Justice and Community Development, a public school serving academic needs of low-income African Americans and Latinos. And in addition, he's also the co-editor of the fabulous book Jackson Rising, and as well as a prolific writer and one of the most fascinating intellectuals on the scene today. Kali. Right next to me, my immediate right, is Harriet Fraad. Harriet Fraad is a mental health longtime friend. Let's say we go back to the days of the Brecht Forum back in the day. Harriet Fraad is a mental health counselor, hypnotherapist in private practice in New York City, and she speaks regularly about the intersecting crisis in U.S. relationships, personal life, politics, and economics. She was a founding member of the second wave women's movement and has remained an activist for her entire life. She appears regularly on Pacifica Radio, WBAI, and also on the Julia Ferrello show, morning show, also on MK Mendoza on KSFR, and Women's Spaces on WBBK. And her work has appeared in Knowledge, Class, and Economics, and Marxism Without Guarantees. Dr. Harriet Fraad Wolf. Harriet Fraad. And last but not least, Açelya Jimenez-Hudis is a 22-year-old digital organizer with the Sunrise Movement, a grassroots youth-led movement, don't forget the youth, led by, that's fighting to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process through the advocating for this Green New Deal. She was born and raised in Brooklyn. Brooklyn. Açelya has seen how devastating the impact of climate change has been in the working class, immigrant, and communities of color. Soon learning after the state Senate district was represented by a Democrat who took corporate money and caucused with Republicans, thus stalling a host of desperately needed progressive policies in New York. Aracely went all in with the Sunrise Movement to do electoral work during the 2018 midterms. And she's continuing with the Sunrise Movement in the mobilization for calling for the Green New Deal. And today she works full-time for the Sunrise Movement to digitally recruit new people into the movement to build grassroots support for the Green Deal in every corner of the country. Açelya. So the way this is gonna work is that we're gonna have the presenters speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. There'll be some internal conversation amongst the panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers from the audience. And so, without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Harvey. Check one, check two.
Hello. Okay, so what is left to be done? I really felt like turning it around and saying, what should the left be doing? But, okay, I'll start with something that is left to be done. We need to abolish the capital class.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Now, I know that sounds, quite ridiculous, but actually, historically, it's not unfeasible. After World War II, developmental economists and all the rest of it decided that there was a class that stood in the way of economic development, which was the landed class, with latifundiars and huge land holdings. And they decided to abolish them. And so we have this big wave of land reform, which is effectively dispossessing a landed elite of its properties and redistributing those properties to the mass of the population. So actually, there you have a program which was designed to abolish the power of a particular class, which in this case was the landed, semi-feudal class that was in the way. Why should we not, as socialists right now, say that that's what we want to do to the capitalists? We want to appropriate their wealth and we want to redistribute it throughout society in such a way so that everybody can construct a decent house and a decent living environment and get on with their lives without having to confront the enormity of all of the power the capitalist class wields in terms of just few families controlling, I don't know what it is, but most of the world's wealth. Why would we not say that is one of the big things to do? Why wouldn't we be talking about that all the time? Because do it, let's do it. Now, Marx had a very interesting point about this when he kind of said that the capitalist class is concentrating so much wealth and leaving behind such a mass of working people and dispossessed people that that mass can surely overwhelm those few capitalists. Well, we have the mass on our side, so why don't we do it? Why aren't we thinking about it? And why aren't we articulating that that is what we want to do? So that would be my first proposition. My second proposition would be that I think we need to defend and augment and enhance the commons. those things which are held in commons and which capital has increasingly privatized. And there are a whole set of things here which, of course, need, I think, to be considered. We're not only talking about land and air and water and climate and all those other things. But one of the areas I think is vitally important is knowledge. And what's happened in recent times is that knowledge has been enclosed in private property rights. And so we've had, over the last 30 or 40 years, and this is the tail end of neoliberalism, the rise of all of this fuss about intellectual property rights and protecting intellectual property rights. Well, intellectual property rights are a violation of what seems to me to be the law of the commons, which is that knowledge is commons to all of humanity and it should be held in open for all of us. I hit this in a very peculiar way a couple of years back when I was traveling and I had a bit of an urgency and I needed to consult one of my own papers, and I went on the web and I found the paper, and I suddenly found that in order to read my own paper I had to pay $25.
Did you pay it?
No. I just made a lousy presentation instead. But here there is something which is also terribly important about class configurations. And I was reading this very interesting book by Soren Rethel, which is about divisions of labor, right? And one of the points he makes is that the division between mental and manual labor is actually also the basis for class distinction. And that one of the things that the capitalist class is doing in terms of its educational strategies, its elite universities, the paying for getting into universities, the rationing of access to knowledge and all that kind of thing, it's actually reinforcing class power by confining a certain kind of power of knowledge to a certain segment in the population. And I think that here too, if we kind of said, look, all of that knowledge should be open to everybody and should be equally available and could be equally communicated, that this is one of the principles of a socialist education, which I think we really should push and recognize that even if you took away all of the property which the bourgeoisie controls, actually, if they still had the knowledge, they would still be able to reconstruct their class power. And I think that knowledge and the commons is very important. And, you know, we live in a country right now where China bashing is incredibly kind of everywhere. And one of the things they're bashed for is stealing intellectual property rights. I'm glad they do it. I'm glad they do it. I just hope they can get there as fast as they can. And by the way, the hypocrisy is immense because the United States has stolen intellectual property rights from all over the world throughout its history. It took all the German scientists after the war and turned them to Cape Canaveral, and it took all of the Russian scientists and sort of, and it still does that with software engineers from India and all the rest of it. In other words, the US has pirated all kinds of things, and now it's turning around and saying, and now turning around and saying, oh, the Chinese are doing all these nasty things, and the nasty Chinese, and we have to stop them doing it because, you know what? There's an advantage that comes to any country that has capital-intensive labor versus labor-intensive labor. I can go through a kind of Marx's analysis of this, which shows that there is a redistribution of value from those sectors of the commodity which are labor-intensive to those which are capital-intensive, and that is also labor-intensive countries to capital-intensive. So one of the things that happens is if you want to avoid being in difficulty, you protect your knowledge structure because that is the basis of actually you're being able to collect value from the rest of the world. So one of the things that Donald Trump is doing by trying to stop China moving into more valuable and more intellectually challenging areas of production is to preserve China as a labor-intensive economy from which the US can extract value, because the US is a capital-intensive economy. So this is why this area of knowledge and knowledge production and knowledge transfer becomes really very, very significant. So there are many issues of this kind that I think that we should be paying attention to. And in a way, following on from this, I think one of the things we really need is a mass educational project for one very simple reason. You know, I remember a moment back in about 1973, I think it was, when Richard Nixon, who was kind of a real right-wing asshole, kind of says, oh, we're all Keynesians now. It was a very interesting remark, because actually there's a sense right now in which we're all neoliberals without quite realizing it and quite understanding it. So one of the things we have to do, I mean, Foucault used to go on about how we have to deal with the fascism in our own heads. We've got to deal very much with the neoliberalism that's in our own heads. We've accepted very much of the neoliberal ethic. For instance, this notion of being entrepreneurialism in the self. When something goes wrong, it's personal responsibility, all those kinds of issues. In the foreclosure crisis, for example, of housing, most of the people foreclosed upon blamed themselves, not the system, for what happened. We have to re-educate people away from some of these neoliberal prescriptions and principles. And to do that means that we have to actually do something with the institutions which have grown up around neoliberalism. And neoliberalism took what Mao called a long march through the institutions. So that law is now being restructured around neoliberal principles. Trading agreements, the WTO is a neoliberal institution, and it's a regulator of a lot of forms of global trade, though I'm very glad to see that Donald Trump wants to overthrow it. So there are many of these institutions which are there, which are essentially structured in a neoliberal way, and which we accept as kind of being norm. For instance, the European Union is completely structured along neoliberal lines and engaged in neoliberal politics internally and also internationally. So I think that dealing with this hangover of neoliberalism and what it does to us and how we think and the like is something which needs also to have very close attention. So many other things I might want to say, but I think I probably used up my time, so let me just stop there and then we can continue the debate afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm glad you didn't pay that $25 because I would have been mad. Callie? Yes, I'm
still taking notes. All right, I'm going to try to build on that since I agreed with every point of it, which, I haven't done so on everything on all these panels. I think the first thing I would touch on, which is urgent, is the need to build strong, dynamic mass social movements, in addition to the pieces that were laid out. And corresponding with that, we're definitely going to have to build some new organizations focused on social transformation, new political parties, in essence. And we have to learn, I think, the essential lessons from the various traditions coming from the 19th century forward, and try to bring some synthesis from all of those traditions forward. Now, what do I mean by that? So, to be clear, I am talking about the anarchist tradition. I'm talking about the revolutionary nationalist tradition. I'm talking about the socialist tradition. I'm talking about the communist tradition. I'm talking about the feminist tradition. And I'm talking about the environmentalist tradition. We have to bring that all together, I think, in some new synthesis and do so in a broad democratic way. That's going to be a challenge. It's not going to be easy, but if it was easy, it would have been done already. So I think that's kind of in part our opportunity. And then we have to, there's a big tension that we have that I don't know how necessarily to deal with, but other than to recognize it and then collectively put our heads together, with our collective genius and figure it out. But we know this type of development takes time, right? To build these social movements, to build the type of organization that we're talking about. We know that takes time. Problem is, I'm one who believes we don't have much time. That there's a certain set of tipping points. Number one, I believe we've already passed. And then there's a couple of other benchmarks, both on the ecological side and the climate side, that we're rapidly approaching it. If we don't figure out, how to address them within the next 5 to 10 years, some things are going to be irreversible for the next 100,000 to maybe 1 million years. And we will probably long be gone if we don't get our shit together as a species, unless we make some quick, decisive action. So that we got a challenge there, a deep challenge of, how to go both broad but deep at the same time. And it's not an easy one because, one of the things I really appreciate David bringing up is this division between manual and mental labor, because that's also reproducing our movement very badly, right, in a lot of our organizations. And I know we have it in some aspects of our work in Cooperation Jackson. I've been trying to figure out how do we eliminate that kind of gap. So it's not easy, but we got to collectively figure this particular piece out. I think to build the strong movements that don't lend themselves to the same type of internal exploitative and abusive practices that we witnessed, the last 200 plus years. So that's a particular piece I think we're going to have to figure out. And then on the American side, I'm going to repeat some of the things that I talked about in the last one because I think it's just pertinent for this particular audience. That I think there's some concrete things that we can walk away from here, given who is constituted in the left forum space, who we are, what we're connected to. Again, some of this is based on my assumptions of what I know about some of the folks here and the formations that folks come from and the social movements that folks come from. And I think there's basically kind of a 3-point program that I will put out. And, this is all subject to debate, but I believe you put forward your best idea and then you debate it out. So a couple of things that really wanted to stress, in order to, basically abolish the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, there's a level of self-organization amongst the working class that we absolutely have to get back into doing. I think, and would make an argument for, just given the dynamics that we live in right now, and we can debate some of this later on, and we welcome it, but I think one of the critical things that we need to do is really kind of ground ourselves in both the thinking and the practice of solidarity economics as a starting point towards building economic democracy as kind of a transitional piece towards the construction of eco-socialism. I'm a firm believer of that. The second point, and these are not supposed to be linear or succession, they have to happen at this, simultaneously. The second point is that we have to really do some concentrated effort to bridge the gap between what I think are the two most organized sectors of the working class in the United States anyway, and that is the trade union movement and the cooperative movement, to bring them back into one fold and tent. Because as I think most of us know, at one point in time, they were the same movement, at two distinct movements in a lot of respects. And so there's an effort to bring them back under a broad program of organizing the working class and see themselves both in that camp. And this is not going to be easy because we know there's going to be a great deal of struggle within the trade unions to take a different approach and a different orientation. But I think this is a critical time to at least start making the argument and building that force from below within the trade union movement to do so, because it is dying. And I think we have to approach our comrades, based there with that concrete understanding. But there's some critical things, even in this weakened state that it has, that I think will be critical to the first piece. So, the AFL-CIO in particular sits on a tremendous, pension fund that they invest in a lot of the wrong shit. And they also have a number of different funds that they invest in development, like housing development and things of that nature, that they could easily redirect towards building out worker-owned and controlled enterprises, right? And we can do our own development. Now, it can't stop there, because even if those two sectors get together, that's still not a strong enough force, to transform this economy, right, and to transform this society. So a critical component of this, of those two divisions of the class, kind of getting the class organizing project to get back together, is we then have to really try to organize in a broad sense along kind of, I would put it as a class conscious model, organizing the large sectors of this country that are not organized. And I think it has to be done, and this may be controversial here, but I think it has to be done along the lines of like the old IWW type model, right, in many respects. And then the third piece, that I'll hit on, I think just as a broad political directive, in line with, I think, some of the urgency that was spoken to. We need to prioritize really confronting and dismantling the petrochemical industry in this empire. And we need to focus on democratizing technology and data. I think there's urgency equally around both of those two. One, I think we often speak of in many respects, either through the anti-war movement or the climate movement. The second one, I think, is a new piece. This democratization of tech and data is a new piece, I think, to much of us on the left. But to the extent that technology companies like Amazon, Google, or Huawei, or whatever, are beginning to take an ascending role in capital, we're going to have to take them on critically because it's involving us, this kind of, if you want to call it surveillance capitalism, it's involving us and integrating us in a lot of fundamental ways that could be deeply socially controlling if not careful. So there's some things that we need to definitely grapple with that ahead of time, and it includes doing some broad education on it now so that people even understand what this contest is about, what this challenge and usurpation of power is about in terms of data in particular. So I'll stop there for now. I mean, there's a lot more that comes with that, but that's just, I think, an add-on contribution that hopefully folks find some use in, and we can argue and debate or build it out further together.
Okay, good.
Your microphone, you wanna,
Oh, yeah, sorry.
you wanna turn it on for you?
Yes.
Sure, no problem. Check one. Check two.
Good. All right, I'm going to address something different. And because I don't think you have any revolution unless you have a revolution in the way people treat each other in their personal lives and the way they treat their children. And so in that respect, America has had a revolution that the left didn't even notice beneath its nose. What happened? And why did it happen? And what is it? Well, what happened is a transformation of the household. And it happened because before 1970,
Second, Harriet, there seems to be some sort of interference. I'll try this microphone over here. See if that doesn't give so much feedback.
okay,
That's better. Right?
before 1970, America was, first of all, a predominantly white nation. In 1970, 87.5% of Americans were white. Is this coming through? Is that better? Okay. That has changed. But for white men between 1820 and 1970, each generation, with some dips, could do better than the last. Because in the scarce, racist, sexist labor market we had, white men got 2 bonuses, one for their white skin and another for their sexual privilege. However, that changed in 1970 and in the 70s. What changed it? The jet engine, the invention of computers, international rapid communications systems, robotization and mechanization meant that the whole world could be exploited by US capitalism. You didn't have to give anybody a supplement of any kind because workers in China and India work for less than $4 an hour. The Chinese get the most, but it's less than $4, without labor protections, without ecological constraints, and without health benefits, without pensions. What a bonanza for capitalism. And so unlike the Trump message that it's refugees, uppity women, and minorities who stole your jobs, no, the capitalists outsourced them. Now, that changes everything because you no longer have a family depending on a wage-earning male and dependent wife and children in the white community. Black community never had that, and they never had the family connection and continuation that the white community did. You know, even in 1970, 24% of black children were born outside of a marriage and 3% of white children. Now 42% across the board are born outside of a marriage because marriages were sustained by the family wage, where women stayed because they economically had to and because they were supported at home. That has changed. And so that marriage and family have changed. Instead of a stable trajectory for the mass of Americans, everything is precarious. Young people don't even know if they're going to have a planet, no less a stable job. And they're not going to have a stable job. The new thing is for people when they get a job to rent, and they think they'll stay a while, they rent furniture, they rent pictures or get cheap posters, they rent their clothes for work so that they can move and get everything into their car when they have to go, because they assume they have to go. That has all changed. What are the results? Well, the result is the old family form of the dependent wife and children and the wage-earning male has collapsed. The majority of marriages end in separation or divorce. Most people of marriageable age, which they call prime fertility age, 18 to 35, aren't married. The majority of women aren't married out of choice. And 57% of American households don't have kids, because why have kids? I mean, also, we don't protect our children because we used to depend on immigrants to have children. It takes a generation or two before they realize children don't pay here. And so they had children, no more. So that personal life is in transition. The old form of marriage was like feudalism, medieval feudalism, where the serfs, by dint of their birth, served the Lord. And women, by dint of their birth as women, served men. They did emotional labor, they did sexual labor, they did cooking and cleaning and connecting men to other people. They did the emotional labor of keeping the family together and listening and helping the man. And the man provided the family wage. There were two jokes that I've told before, but really summarize it. The man's joke was, there's a handy little thing called a wife. You screw it on the bed and it does all the housework and takes care of you and the kids. Terrific. The women's joke was, men are like linoleum. You lay them right once, you could walk on them for 20 years and they support you, right? Though humor captures realities people don't want to face, but that was the reality. That family was not a great thing, but it was stable. It was stable. And the children of those families before 1970 imagined they did have a future. And that's very different from now, when the doors are closing on people. That family was a feudal family, because the feudal serf and lord also pledged love and fidelity to each other, and the terms were enforced by the more powerful member, just as they were in the household. It wasn't until '74 that the first child protection legislation passed, and it wasn't until '72 that unmarried women could get the pills so that we could control our own fertility, and women started staying in college because they didn't get pregnant and drop out. So our gains are recent. Now, in the chaos and disruption of the old family form, new family forms have formed. One is the independent family, people living alone or alone with their children. And that is an increasing family form where women and men create their own domestic labor, their own childcare if there are children, their own emotional connections, their own sexual connections, and are not tied down by anything with a future because they don't imagine they necessarily have one. And this started basically because women, white women, joined their African American sisters and had to join the labor force to survive. That happened in 1970. And then they weren't excited about coming home to a second shift of labor for their husbands. Sexual labor, emotional labor, connecting him with friends and neighbors, taking care of the children, and so on. And a lot of men, because they were humiliated in their lower positions at work, wanted extra from women to compensate them for this demotion. That didn't work out well. That's why the majority of marriages end in divorce, and 80% of divorces are now initiated by women. That's all changed. As I have said before, my daughter summarized it for me when I told her that in my youth, they had an old saying to keep women virginal: why buy the cow if you could get the milk for free? And she said, you know what I say, Mom? Why keep a pig in your house if all you want is sausage? Different attitude. Much more modern. And it's women who now refuse marriage. So there are these independent households that are formed, and there's also communal households where people have the ideal of sharing their income from outside and their labor inside the house. Those aren't measured statistically, so we don't know how many, but it is certainly an impulse which is very strong. And the kind of struggles that we see and that we have to fight are shadow struggles for these different class forms in the household. A communal or communist class form, an independent form, or a feudal form. And I should say there is another form that's being advocated by the right, the religious right, and that is the fascist feudal family that only appeared once before in history, where women had to work up to 60 hours a week in the munitions factories, but were still totally responsible for children, for the household, and for men's emotional welfare and sexual welfare. Now, of course, they didn't reproduce as fast as the government wanted, even though abortion and birth control were banned because they were so exhausted they couldn't get pregnant. However, that is the right-wing agenda, as they praise family and praise the wonderful work women do and take away every possibility of enabling families to really stay together and cooperate. That's why they oppose divorce, but the red states get a lot more divorces than the blue states. And the biggest porn state is Utah, a theocracy. So they're not doing too well, but that is their form. And these shadow struggles that we see on family leave, on abortion, which they're trying to take away, on the access to free birth control through Planned Parenthood, on sex education, not abstinence education, on free quality child care and affordable after-school care, on universal health care. These are revolutionary battle sites for the independent family and the communist family or communal family versus the fascist feudal family. And so we need to pay attention on the left to family, to personal life, and to the class divisions that, and the class changes that have happened and what we want to promote. These are not just cute women's issues. These are issues about revolutionary transformation of our country, from the most personal out to the political. And the left has missed the boat on it. The right is very big on family programs. And we have nothing to say. And that has to change. And that's what I wanted to address here.
Yeah, thank you.
Check. There we go. Thank you, whoever in the audience just helped me. Wonderful. Yeah, as Kazembe said, my name is Aracely Jimenez, and I'm a digital organizer with Sunrise Movement. And yeah, we're youth-led. And yeah, right now our biggest organizing project is around advocating for the Green New Deal. But something that I want to make clear that I think is definitely being lost today in our fight against the right is that, yeah, I and Sunrise Movement at large and the multitude of partner organizations and grassroots movements that we're working with, we all understand that the Green New Deal is not a single piece of legislation. It's not even a package of legislation. The Green New Deal is really what we see as a pathway to establish what we consider could be a new governing agenda for this country, and a pathway to basically change the ruling ideology of this country in a way that will last for generations. And in order to achieve this vision, I really took this question in a more practical way. So yeah, if you'll allow me to just sort of jump into that. Yeah, in order to achieve this, we envision that there's a moment in the next few years where like the collective we, the left, Sunrise in partnership with a coalition of literally thousands of organizations and other grassroots movements. Basically, we envision that there's a moment where we turn out millions of people in the streets in every corner of this country with a strong, unified ask for the rest of our society and of all levels of our government. And there's a lot of work to be done to achieve that and to achieve that vision. And basically, the first big thing is that we need to actually come together and understand what that ask should be. And basically, we have this vision because in our study as Sunrise before we launched, we saw in our check. Okay. Lots to choose from. Thank you. Right, where was I? Yeah, so the first task is we need to understand what that ask should be. And yeah, in our study of social movements before we officially launched as Sunrise a couple of years ago, we saw that there's been plenty of research that tells us that basically no movement has failed that has been able to turn out about 3.5% of its population consistently. So for me, I feel really grounded in that number, and I'm a person who feels really grounded in like practical strategy. And so when I hear that, I think, okay, 3.5% of the population of the United States is about 13 million people. That's a goal that I can work towards. That's a goal that the left can work towards. And yeah, we need to start, I think, strategically thinking how we can make these goals more tangible to people like outside of this room and outside of rooms like this where folks are gathering all across the country. Yeah, so yeah, we need to understand what that ask is that we make, ideally in 2021, in the face of ideally a new Congress and a new administration. We need to turn out tens of millions of people in the streets and make a unified ask that basically reestablishes our democracy as a true democracy and takes on the fossil fuel industry for what it is. And basically motivating these millions of people not just to take action one time in their lives, but actually able to absorb them into movement structures so that we can continue the work beyond that moment. So in answering that question, we also need to build that coalition of thousands of grassroots movements and organizations. And I think I want to echo, if I can, what Harriet said, is that we need to also be thinking about how we treat each other in movement spaces, and we need to understand that everyone who's coming to the table does have a different role to play for the movement. And right now, what I've experienced as someone who's a part of Sunrise, I've seen folks look to us as conveners of the left, and we just really don't see ourselves in that role because we are so young. We're really looking to movement elders to play that role of conveners. But what we are saying is that we do want to be at the table because we have been able to be very successful at turning out youth and making sure that there's fresh blood in the movement and making sure that our energy is sustainable. That's another thing that we need to do, and that Sunrise is working really diligently on, is how do we even get young people to turn out in the first place, and how do we get them to go all in, basically giving their full time to the movement. And this is a difficult task that is obviously only getting harder. First of all, just drawing from my own personal story, I started organizing with Sunrise about a year ago. My anniversary is coming up soon, which is nice, yeah. And it really is just that. It's basically my 1-year anniversary of organizing. I'm 22 years old. There wasn't any opportunity to learn about movement history. Obviously, it's not taught in our school structures for obvious reasons, and it's knowledge that has to be sought out. And so that's obviously an obstacle. And then also, as young people, we're facing more and more challenges with mental health. It's getting more and more difficult to actually connect to each other on a human level. And as we face surmounting debt, we're basically forced to make this really horrific, paradoxical choice where either we have to we're basically being forced to plan for a future that at the same time we're being told won't exist. And so we're going into hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. And there's obviously not a lot of space in the movement where we feel like we can give all our time to the movement and then also survive with this crushing weight that's on our shoulders. That obviously takes a lot of strategic thinking and planning to mobilize youth at the scale that we need to win. And I will say that one way Sunrise is trying to combat that is drawing on movement history, trying to really have a movement house model that lasts for years and years, basically as long as folks keep donating to us. A movement house model where folks live and organize together in houses in their communities and share emotional labor, share the labor of cooking and cleaning the house. And Sunrise then pays for whatever their needs are, mental and physical health needs, whatever they need to thrive and to be the best organizers that they can. So I do think that it is possible for the movement to make space for young people to become full-time organizers and just make sure that they have the support that they need, because it is something that is really, really pretty desperately needed right now. I just also want to say something that might be obvious to some people, but I definitely see it in a lot of my work. As a digital organizer, I'm in the world of communications a lot. And I just feel like every time I open up the projects that I'm working on, every time I go to manage my social media, every time I go to organize folks online, I end each day feeling so absolutely crushed by the right. And it's because they have this, this monstrosity of a media machine that has been perfected for decades. And I just think that there's no equivalent on the left. There isn't even a base of an equivalent on the left. And I think a really big conversation that needs to happen as we come together in these spaces is that we need to we need to start sharing our collective knowledge of storytelling and really start thinking about how we can build our own propaganda machine because it's very desperately needed. So I wanted to keep this brief so that we could get into a really interesting conversation. So Kazembe, if you're ready, I think I'm ready to pass it back to you.
Okay, that's really wonderful. Thank you so much, Açelya, and thank you to our panelists. Oh, it's not, hello? Can you hear it now? Yeah, a little better. I'm like the Verizon guy. Can you hear me?
I hear you, but...
Okay, whoa. Is there anything I can do that,
Check. Try this one.
yeah. Okay, thank you so much. Oh, wait, let me try this one first.
Moving this thing over.
Hello? Yeah, this is better. Thank you so much. I just wanted this, before I just take it to the audience, I just wanted to maybe connect a few points between David, Callie, Harriet, and Açelya, because I feel like there's like moving, there was a lot, definitely points that were kind of like in the air, and I just want to kind of connect the dots a little bit. So I love what you had said about neoliberalism, David, and one of the things I noticed about neoliberalism is also means the lack of rights, and it's also defined by lack, not only there's a lack of rights, but like your citizenship is also connected to your identity as a consumer, you know, and not necessarily as based on any type of civic rights or even human rights in that sense. And you gave a good example of terms of talking about the privatization of education. This week we saw a massive debate around the issue around student loan debt that was initiated by Bernie Sanders and folks like Astra Taylor, who's been working on issues around debt rate, who's a filmmaker. But also, I mean, one thing that's important as looking back in terms of our cultural and historical imaginary, for example, of a place like CUNY, the City University of New York, that from the 19th century up until 1975 was a free university. And so there was an imaginary of an actual free university that you would have education from K all the way to college for free. And that's been kind of like taken away in a place for this idea around debt. And I think that one commentator online had mentioned that this idea around debt was really kind of like, was really something that was sold to the American public. So we exchanged the idea of labor rights in favor of going back to school and getting an education as opposed to fighting for labor rights. So in order to deal with the labor issue, we said we're gonna educate. And that's something that's always been told, for these kind of like people who've been laid off of factories, well, if we just go back to school and you get a job and things of that nature. And that kind of actually brings me also to Callie's point, I think, around the idea around democratization of technology. Because I think traditionally what we've seen, particularly amongst black folks, is that the technology has always meant automation has been like, meaning that black folks in particular have been pushed out of the labor market, more into the precarious market, more into just the crisis of the prison system is also a crisis of labor, in a lot of different ways. And so some of the work of Cooperation Jackson in some ways has been trying to like recapture some of this power of technology and democratization of technology, specifically in black communities, to address this issue around unemployment, but also human needs, but also this other part around technology is also this question around gentrification. Gentrification has not only meant like the kind of pushing out of people from land, but also this kind of entire intense technological surveillance capitalism that's existing. So like if you live in a gentrified impact community, there's more likely you have like services like, you have, first of all, you have precarity walking with gentrification, service industries, Uberization, Ubers, Fresh Direct, everything you can buy from an app, every imaginable thing you can get with an app, right? So the idea that, the city life is one of technological convenience in that, and I think some of that stuff around in Sunset Park, around Industry City has been a question around that too. Something I just want to kind of mention around Harriet's work that's really interesting to me is this idea around, I love what you had said around, shut up, Google. I love what you had said a little bit about the family. And I was just kind of thinking back also that the fact that the gender roles within the labor force has changed. And, and so you have more male teachers and more male nurses and men going into traditional caring economy. And I'm questioning and I'm wondering, how are you seeing this? Is this a possibility of a new frontier of a more caring, nurturing male figure or challenging towards patriarchy? Or is this going to be simply a reshifting of pushing women out? I want to get your ideas around that. And also, I love what you had said around what does the left family planning look like, or socialist family planning look like? And economic-wise, I know there's been some conversation around universal basic income, some of those ideas. I'm wondering some of that dovetailing around wages for housework and things of that nature. But last but not least, Açelya, and I was really appreciative of what you said. You wanted that 3.5% of the population as a goal. And one of the things I'm realizing is that, there's a term that's always used these days, the term is populism, but sometimes we don't really talk about populism in connection to crowdsourcing and technology, and the ways in which like the development of the crowd has been like the fundamental feature of 2010. So since Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter. So from 2010 to now, we've seen about 5 different movements in Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, the Fight for 15.
I don't know more.
I don't know more. I don't know more. And these are all have been digitally driven in terms of how we form crowds and how we form connections. So I'm wondering, thinking through issues around digital creation of crowds and how that's kind of, is the crowd the same as democracy? And lastly, in the question of this term, conveners of the left, how to create intergenerational actions amongst the left is an important thing. And I love what you had said about this. I want to hear more about this movement house. This movement house sounds like fabulous. I'm thinking a lot about it reminds me, it makes me go back to the ideas of the old Catholic worker houses. Saying back in the day, that kind of keeping what Callie said in terms of bringing back an anarchist socialist spirit within movement spaces. So I just kind of did an outline of some stuff that I kind of picked out for me. I'm sure there's other stuff, but I'm wondering if this time of stuff that I said that outlined that maybe sparked something in you that you want to respond to. I know there's some direct questions in there, but I wanted to save some time. So you guys want to take that on?
Maybe we can hear from the audience.
Oh, you want to go direct to the audience? Okay, we're going to go directly to populism. Okay, so... All right, democracy. So the way I'm going to do this is I see you. I'm going to choose it, but I'm going to do a stack according to gender and representation, so we make sure we have everyone in. So starting with this gentleman right here, and we'll start, okay?
Yeah. I'd like to ask about ideas for getting outside the box, the way of the internet, the way it defines us and represents it and boxes us in. So I know I'm talking to, among others, a digital organizer, but when we began Citizens Defending Libraries, I remember a conversation with a woman working in a bookstore, and she said, well, you gotta get on Twitter, you gotta have a YouTube channel, you gotta get your Facebook. And we did all that, and it's to an extent effective, and then I hear about digital building crowds, but I also heard that we're dealing with internet monopolies, and the phrase that if we're not careful, these could be deeply socially controlling, and I think we haven't been careful, and they are. We're here where we can talk to each other face to face. We're in a physical assembly. That's one way out where we don't get manipulated. There's other extensions to that, like terrestrial radio. So, for instance, there's WBAI as a commons where we communicate and exchange information. But the internet is treacherous even as it serves us. It pulls us in, lures us in with freebies. But what the internet give it, the internet easily takes it away at any moment. So how do we have our movements and have them vital and define them outside of the control of the internet and the internet box?
Yeah, I can try and take a stab at that. Yeah, it's definitely.
How do we take the? So the question the gentleman had asked was, how do we create a movement out of the internet box?
Yeah, so I should expand more on like what my role is with Sunrise. It's like trying to like catch people's attention in like the 3 seconds that they give their attention to anything on the internet and like pull them immediately into like offline action, or like as quickly as I can into offline action. And so how we've had a lot of success by basically like live streaming escalated moral protest and basically like cutting those live streams and some like into like more polished videos that looked like really attention grabbing and like similar to like a hype video that you might see for like advertising like a concert or like a music festival in a big city. But instead, it's a bunch of kids protesting at the DNC. And we've had success with like running, posting those videos and running those videos as advertisements, and then basically having an ask at the end of the video that says, come to this online mass call. And we've had a lot of success with that, where basically we run the mass call as basically as like an online rally, in a sense, where we go over our movement goals, we give a taste of our movement DNA, and we essentially recount our wins from the past like month or 2 months, and we really like give everyone on the call a sense of momentum, but they're just in their home, they're in a comfortable space, they're not really risking anything by being together in that moment, even though they're like entering like a left movement space, which for some people like can feel risky sometimes. And basically at the end of those mass calls, we have asks for people to take offline action, to join folks in their own communities, and to take like autonomous action where they plan things themselves. And they select like the targets that they want to go after in their own planned, morally escalated protests. And unfortunately, like those are like a lot of steps, and you do like lose people along the way. So it's not like very streamlined, but we have had success in that. And success for me looks like, I think, around like 500 to 1,000 people on those mass calls when we have them, and mostly lots of new faces, which is really exciting to see.
But you don't call their information when they contact you?
Well, if they've signed up to take the mass call, there's an optional like sign up form where folks can put their name and their email address, and it's clear that they're like signing up to get updates. Yeah.
How are you funded?
How are we funded? Mostly by grassroots donations. We do have some major donors, but basically our policy is we'll only take major donations if it's very clear that there are no strings attached, because we don't want to be restricted in our targeting, in our targeting for like protest. I think, I want Kazembe to moderate.
Yeah, I was. You want to respond to that, Kelly?
Yeah.
It's more of a challenge.
Okay. Yeah.
To your question. So this is something I've been thinking about. I think I may only articulate it once or twice, but was it Pokemon Go?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pokemon Go? I hate Pokemon. It's slavery. But I would love to see left programmers develop something on our own independent software that mirrored bringing people together for a random assortment of tasks, right? Or just pure pleasure type shit. But with the function of bringing us together to do things collectively. I think this is a very necessary thing, because as I read it, neoliberalism is not just an economic program. A large part of it was a cultural program, a social program, with the very, explicit intent of individuating us and cutting us off from social solidarity and seeing the need to be with each other to do anything. And I think it's been very damn successful in accomplishing that particular end. We have to be, I think the left needs to be very explicit about, we have to build solidarity through all the different means we can. I think technology can be an enabler of bringing people together rather than fracturing them apart, but it's going to take some very intentional development, procurement, and some creativity of our thinking of what are the different things that are bringing people together. To party, to play, to do sports, to debate, and some of it would have to be, I think, as I see it, random. And I would say that for intentionally, like, what was that? 2006 was when there was like a day without an immigrant, or and some of that how that was mobilized. But I remember there was, after the big rally that happened, like in Los Angeles, there were some smaller ones that were like 200,000 or 300,000 people for a while, where they were very intentionally, some of the organizers just like calling them on the fly, with the intent of like not having something that would be so pre-planned that the police could be up on it, right? But do it in a random sense where like it's chaos, but a chaos that we create and we orchestrate to our own end. Like that is something I think we also need to think about in terms of breaking the cycle, breaking their habit, breaking their control.
I want to call it Khalid. Yep. You want a woman to go? Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I didn't see a woman raise her hand as of yet. Okay, yeah.
I have two questions. I'm going to make them short. But they're based out of my experience. I'm going to say, I am a city councilman in Georgia. I'm a socialist. And one of the things that I've noticed in my 2 years on council is that under the guise of economic development, corporations are stealing lots of public tax dollars through like bond financing, tips and tags, and like all of these sort of things, right? So one of the things that I've been thinking about is how do I get those dollars back to the public? How can I use public dollars to do like co-ops or Açelya? Now I'm thinking about like, can I do a movement house where you do like a city year or whatever. But so my first question is, in this transition from dismantling capitalism, what do you see the role of electoral politics being in assisting that transition? And then my second question comes out of my previous experience. I was a Black Lives Matter organizer. I wanted to stop protesting people and actually just take their seats, so that's why I ran. But in that movement space, one of the things that I see happening in our movement spaces is that I see this in movements and I see this in the arts, where dysfunction is disguised as passion. And because we deal with lots of marginalized people, what I find is that when a dysfunctional person, even if it's like maybe a COINTELPRO agent, when they come into a space, we don't really have a mechanism of like holding them accountable or putting them out, because we're sort of paralyzed with the fear of like reproducing the marginalization that we have experienced. So those are my two questions. One, what is the role of electoral politics in transitioning away from capitalism? Then two, how do we deal with problematic people in movement spaces without reproducing the trauma that we experience?
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, Harry, you want to take that?
I would like to address the latter part of that question about marginalized people. I think you have to think about what is the good of the group. And if somebody's unintelligible or distracting from the purpose of the group, you can say, I can't really see how that relates. Please think about it and try again another time. But, a lot of people need attention, and they go to a movement because they're tolerated and want to get a lot of attention. And that we have to think of the survival of the group. And it's just as the same thing if you are having a group and some people come in and want to take it over. And as a founding mother of women's liberation, I had a rule that was our one rule. Everybody's welcome unless they know exactly what we have to do, then you have to leave. Which I think is important. That and saying, look, the group is not relating to this, try again another time. That's not being mean, it's not saying get out of here, but you have to put the group first, or else marginalized people create such discomfort that people leave because they don't want that in their movement life.
What about the second question? What about the issue of electoral politics, and what is the role of electoral politics in this current moment right now? Anyone want to take that question on? Some?
Go ahead. We're going to talk about it more. I'm going to make sure I call you, we talk. But the Kali's position is that building a social movement is more important than building electoral pursuits in this particular point in time. Our movements, just as my view, are just at this point too fractured, too weak, too small to dictate to politicians, be they folks from our own ranks or allies of the movement, to dictate terms of them, let alone put enough pressure on the system to make some critical reforms. And I think if you look at most of the fundamental changes, bringing up what Kaz brought up, in the last, say, 15 to 20 years, most of that has been drawn from dynamic social movements, not from electoral campaigns or things that then folks have to respond to. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a role for electoral politics. I think it's just a question of how much time and energy, given where we are at this stage, do we need to be putting into that. I think we need a lot more people on our side. I'm with Aracely in terms of ultimately we need to be thinking about moving people in their millions towards a concrete program and vision, of which electoral politics would be a small component of.
I want to comment on that because I think, of course, there's a role, because having someone like AOC say it like it is, having somebody in leadership who's a real person, not some kind of stuffed phony, and Saban and Julia Salazar gives people hope that we can be out there. We can be saying things. We can be confronting them. But it is true, that's one, so that we can celebrate those people, but not put all our energy there, because we need to build a mass movement. And yet those people have a very strong, positive example for us. AOC is an inspiration, and so is Carter in Virginia.
Okay, we have a question up here. I'm sorry, David, do you want to respond, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to.
Just give me 1 second. I'm going to respond.
I don't know. Yeah, okay. I just wanted to say I'm very glad you got on the city council. I actually think right now that the municipal level is a level of organization that can be conquered and occupied and utilized by the left. And I spent just a couple of weeks ago some time in Barcelona, where, as you know, there has been some difficulties about Ada Colau continuing, but I think this is a very important moment, and I think that the more municipal offices or city councils that are taken over by people like you, it forms a base. And there's an interesting kind of question, which we don't have a good answer to, which is, if you take control of a municipality, and I'd like to hear your comments on this, if you take control, how much can you do in the face of the fact that there are a lot of powers that exist in the state outside, and the capital is knocking you over the head, and the media are giving you shit, and all this kind of stuff? So it's not as if the revolution can be made at the municipal level, but it seems to me it creates an incredibly important base. And of course, there are different traditions about this. If you're an anarchist, you say, I'm never going to elect, you know. If you're a Marxist, you're a Leninist, you say, we're going to take it over, smash the state, and then rebuild it in a socialist line. I mean, all these kinds of different philosophical positions. I always liked the French sort of radical urbanist Henri Lefebvre, and he was asked one time, why are you a Marxist and not an anarchist? And he said he was a Marxist because he wanted one day the whole world to be able to live like anarchists.
That's right.
And I think that's a great answer, actually. And actually, I think it's deeply consistent, by the way, with how Marx was approaching this, because it's often said that Marx is all about kind of collectivism and so on. Actually, Marx was about the liberation of the individual from all forms of restraint, but it had that liberation had to be via collective action. And therefore, the collective action came first, and then the individual liberation follows on that. And so, anyway, I'm very glad that you're doing what you're doing, but I'd love to hear a little more from you about how do you deal with all this nonsense that you get surrounded by.
Me?
Both of you.
So I'm assuming because of the Jackson piece that's what you're, to bring everybody in the audience up. This is, again, just my own position, David, is that you can do a lot. You can actually do a hell of a lot if you go in there with a protagonist view to governance. And to make that plain and simple, if you go in there not trying to manage the contradictions of capitalism, very intent on heightening contradictions, and dealing with the reality that you may or may not, but given in our reality, you may or may not get reelected, right? That you may be facing a very short-term piece, but be clear about what your role is.
You mean you can't gerrymander it, so you...
I mean, you could, but I don't know if you, in our context, if we would want to. And, I mean, there's a lot that I think can be done. But what we've experienced, let me try to, and this is just my interpretation, Brandon may have a different one. What we've experienced is a lack of imagination on the behalf of our comrades who have entered into office and who've immediately gone in trying to manage the contradictions of capitalism, even though we had a agreement that that's not what we were there to do and that's not what we were trying to do. This notion of I have to govern in the interest of everybody. That's a slippery slope notion, and it's one that we fell into very immediately. That contours the protagonist governance. So for me, the protagonist governance that I'm articulating is, look, I'm doing this, like in our case in Jackson, I'm here to serve the interests as best possible of the black working class majority of this city.
That's right.
But what that means is that you are automatically entering into a form of open class war. And that is something I can tell you, sadly, that not enough of our comrades were prepared to do. Because to a certain extent, they didn't feel that we could win, but it's a question of what do you define as winning? So if some people thought like the winning was the end goal of socialism, like we're not gonna build socialism in one small municipality in Mississippi of all places. But we can aid in at least aspiring and opening a spark, to a broader level of social movement development, which was, to my mind at least, was the purpose.
That's right.
Right? But it immediately started coming in when you hear certain statements of like, well, Jackson is open for business, or, I'm the mayor for the whole city, not for, just black people, like the Obama line get re-articulated on a local level. And for some of us, including myself, I was like, well, no. You are the mayor of Black Jackson. let's be clear. And if some other folks want to get on board and get down with the program we articulate, all the better. It's not an exclusionary one, but it's working toward the collective majority and improving its lot. But that comes with certain types of struggles that I think our movement has to have a deeper level of being prepared for. So what I can say from our experience in Jackson, we didn't prepare ourselves enough to really engage full on with what we had set in motion. That's a sad thing to report, but I'm trying to report it to you as honestly as possible so that folks learn from that experience, draw from it, and improve upon it. So I hope that you take it further, or whoever takes it further than what we've taken it to this point. We're not finished. I mean, it's not a done deal. We're trying to learn and assess. But I think this notion that you are limited in what you accomplish is a real one, but you're not limited in what you can try to accomplish. That's the major critical thing that I think we have to be very mindful of in terms of social movements engaging in electoral politics. What are we going to try to accomplish instead of walking in thinking that, with limited goals, like, well, I can only do this in this year period, or I can only do it. Hell, try for everything. Let's go for it. We ain't got nothing to lose at this point. Let's go for it.
I just want to say, half
1 second.
was up for election this year, and I can tell when they started to think about it because our conversations changed.
Totally changed.
Their votes changed. You're compromised by thinking about how do I get reelected so I can do it.
Okay, great. I have a stack now. Hi, I'm over here now. Whoa! Remember Phil Donahue?
Yes.
That's me right now. So I have a stack right now. So I have desist over here. The gentleman over here, is he still here? Okay, wait, where is he? Another gentleman over here, Connor, then down here, okay? And can you make your questions and comments really brief, because there's a lot of people who want to speak. So I'm asking people to be really brief and so we can sharpen it up a little bit, okay? Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if we have a democracy or a hypocrisy. I think that's really a consideration. I heard the word gerrymandering, and that makes my antenna quiver. It really does. I learned this weekend that Mark Twain said, if our vote was worth anything, they wouldn't give us one. What do you think of that?
Yeah.
I would like to suggest a meeting between our political power and education. I think we need to graduate from the Electoral College. What do you think of that?
New forms of democracy. May I also take this gentleman? Where did the gentleman go?
Well, we'll move along.
You want to take a couple of questions?
I'm going to take a couple questions and we're going to move on, okay? Oh, thank you. It's okay, it's okay.
Yes, good evening. I'd like to address this question, Mr. Kali. I heard you speak about the bridging the unions with the cooperatives. And I also know you're an expert on the land trust. Is there a way that you can approach the land trust issue and make it an attractive base in order to support the bridging between the cooperatives and the unions?
Okay, two questions. One is on the nature of democracy. Do we live in democracy? And what is the nature of the issue about the Electoral College, I believe? The other one was a question around the community land trust and how do we make it an attractive base? So, Dr. Kelly. So, do you guys want to take the democracy question first? And who doesn't want to take it? Any one of y'all? Do we live in democracy or hypocrisy?
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move
Oh,
along.
there's a forum. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
We don't live in a democracy.
No.
Unanimous agreement, we don't live.
In the workshop on women, the war on indigenous women and black women and girls, Sister Sandra Rivers suggested that you go online and look at the Electoral College Fight Back, because there are some states that have mandated that now if any popular vote is higher than the other candidate, the Electoral College candidate has to actually vote along the popular votes lines. But I agree with what I just heard from the podium. We don't live in a democracy. So thanks for that question.
Can I add just something? Since Mark Twain has been quoted, I'd also like to remind you, he said that the United States has the best Congress that money can buy.
Okay, listen, after this, okay, sorry. There was a question around the community land trust.
If I could, we, myself and Cooperation Jackson have done a lot of learning from the works of David Harvey around, questions around land. So David, I don't know if you have something that you want to contribute to answering, that based on your experience in work.
Not too much, because I've never run a community land trust. I've looked at them, and I think it's a very interesting form of organization. But I came across recently. Actually, the main, I don't know how you've done it, but to get a community land trust going, you need to get the land, and somebody has to procure the land, and that's where control in the local state becomes very important. But I came across a very interesting case in Puerto Rico, where there's been a sort of a voluntary movement of population into a land trust structure, so that you don't need to procure the land beforehand. You need to persuade the population that they will be better served by reorganizing themselves into a community land trust, which struck me as having a lot more possibilities in it if that's how it evolves. But I don't know. You've actually worked with one, so.
We're developing one. I mean, we've acquired a decent amount of land. But to be clear, we've done that because land is fundamentally cheap in Mississippi. Now, we also did it because we prioritized doing it, which is also important. With the intent on decommodifying it as much as possible, to combat gentrification, which is slowly creeping towards our direction. To combat displacement, which typically comes with gentrification. So that is in part, what our emphasis is on this and why we've given it such a priority. Now, but to the larger question around, can it be something, that a union co-op kind of collaboration could do? Absolutely. But I think there's a great deal of convincing on the union side that this will be something worthwhile, and how we are in the process of laying out an endeavor that we think we're going to at least experiment with to try to capture on our end. One of the critical things that we want to do with this new kind of tech innovation piece that we're trying to explore is develop deeply affordable housing, stuff that people in our community can do through our community production unit. But we want to really, at a certain point, we're going to do some, I think in the course of the next 2 or 3 years, develop our own, build our own housing, create some various different types of models on the community land trust that we already own, and then try to work with, the AFL-CIO to take this up as a coherent project within the city of Jackson to do. Because let me speak to it clearly, and then I'm gonna try to stop. See, for us, there's another component around not just facing trying to fight gentrification, displacement, just on moral grounds. It's essential to the political project. You don't get a Chokwe Lumumba elected or a Chokwe Antar Lumumba elected without a black working class majority, right? And our opposition that somebody asked about earlier, or maybe it was another panel, our opposition, no, it's here. Part of our opposition is very clear. They have in open political documents that they want to reduce the black working class majority from its 80% constitution now to about 60% within the next 10 to 15 years. That's open documents that's out there. And the reason why it's open and stated in the way it is, because they know, given the formula of how electoral politics has traditionally played out in Jackson over the last 20 years, if you can get it down to about 60%, that means you can split the black vote, and then you can, the white ruling class power elite in our area could then pick and choose or who they want from the black community to be the mayor, or run one of their own candidates, which they're starting to gear up for now, and we've been seeing this the last 2 election cycles. So for us, we have to make sure that we keep the population that's there and expand on the overall population with similar, politics, worldview, culture, to extend and grow the development of the overall political power for us, not only in Jackson, but to extend the overall reach of the overall strategy called the Jackson Kush Plan. So for us, this is it seems like it's like a small step, but it's a building block to both preserve what we've been aiming to do and strengthen and empower in the long term. Whether the unions come on board with that is going to take some organizing work, but if they could, we got a lot of things laid out for them that they could already do that would strengthen them and strengthen the overall struggle in our area.
Okay, right on. Kana?
Good evening, everyone.
Yeah, I see you.
I wanted to say...
One second.
Oh, actually, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, the sister, because we haven't had a woman speak yet. Yes.
Thank you. I just applaud the work you're doing, Mr. Kali. I forgot your last name. I have a concern, though, and I hope that you don't think I'm trying to put a lid on what you're doing. Given the history of ways in which whenever African Americans have attempted to build towns and communities, they have been shut down. And if you could just think of what happened to Move, how they were able to go and drop a bomb on there. And I remember several years ago, some people were saying, oh, give us 5 states. And I'm thinking, yeah, we do really great. But then the minute we start doing great, is there a way that we could protect ourselves from being, having bombs dropped and destroying all the work we do, for which I think reparation is due for all those historical ones. So have you given any thought to that? That's my question.
I'm a child of COINTELPRO. I grew up with the FBI, hunting my family, kicking in the doors in the houses that I lived with, hunting people, arresting people, killing people. So that's on my mind every single day of my life. It ain't gonna go nowhere. And it creates a framework, but it also creates some limitations. And so these are some things that I'm trying to unlearn, because there's a certain amount of distrust of folks that I don't know that ain't probably ever gonna go nowhere from that experience. Mm-hmm. So it's very hard for me to really bring anybody in real close to me, because I've been in situations where the person two doors down or 2 seats down is working for them people, right? And we've caught people, and I've been through all that. So yeah, that's always on my mind. I think there's always on our collective mind. There's little things that happen, and sometimes big things that happen in our work, where that's a constant threat. Mississippi wouldn't have no problem wiping us out. Let's be clear about that. And we live in an era where, the thing that I think folks forgot about Hurricane Katrina was that they got away with mass murder. We still don't even know how many people was killed, right? So, if you look at that as a pretext to, the bombastic, totally fucked up language of, Donald Trump, right? That, to me, in my mind, that set a stage to what we now are living for. because there was no deeper interrogation of what the hell happened, why black people wound up being treated like that, and how they got away with it. So we live with that. That's right down the street from us. I was there, many people worked there. But for me, the basic thing is, you know, we have to do, you know, you wouldn't know it probably from this iteration of me, but I'm a deep culture worker. That's part of some of the things that I first started doing, you know, DJ, graffiti artist. I used to do all that and still got a deep love and affinity for it, just don't have time to do it no more. But I'm bringing it up to say that there's certain things I think we have to always draw upon to overcome the fear of what the state has always tried to impose upon us. And for me, you know, I love being in Mississippi because it's the soil that some of my ancestors were directly enslaved on. Some of my folks are from there. And I always just draw back that, look, if they survive that, then, you know, the worst that they can do to me has already been done. That's kind of my mentality. So, you know, you got to step in without no fear. I know what they can do. I know what they have potential to do. I've seen it all my life. You know, so now it's just how do we set up the little things that we can protect ourselves from? How do we build our community that understands that, you know, they can come through this door any minute and do what they want to do. We got an obligation to fight back. We got a right to fight back should they come and try to move on us. We ain't gonna never surrender that. And that's the space that we have to walk in. But, you know, the deeper piece that you probably heard me, Saki, Brandon, other members of Cooperation Jackson say, we're gonna do all that we can do and possibly do, you know, to fulfill the promise of our project. But we can't exist in the long term in isolation, right? So we need strong movements here. We need strong movements throughout this country so that if they move on any one of us, we have the capacity to respond to whatever they're doing. And believe me, they're gonna respond. I mean, right now, there are several states that have already basically illegalized protesting pipelines. Trump is trying to federalize that, right? And so there's very real attempts in the here and now to limit, you know, peaceful protests, civil protests of any form or fashion. So we better get, you know, and I think they're gonna pass a lot of this stuff. What they just did was 2 or 3 days ago with the you know, accepting partisan gerrymandering stuff and saying that that's a legal part of how the state is going to function. I think we've entered into a new stage where we're going to have to really reconsider, you know, the cost of fighting immoral laws and get back to accepting those costs, because that's the only way that I think we're going to defeat this beast that's in front of us. And no more questions for me. I didn't talk too much.
Hi, everyone. So we've reached the end of the plenary. It's now 9 o'clock. So we don't have time for any more questions?
Oh.
It's 9 o'clock.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. It's 9, but if we reach the end, we have to close out the plenary.
Wait 1 second. I'm saying maybe just close it. I'm really
to close it out.
We're on a tight timeline because we're all renting the space, and you know. But I want to thank once again Samantha, our panelists.
Yes.
Harvey, Harriet, Açelya, Kali, and I want to thank you guys all for being here. This is the official close of Left Forum 2019. Looking forward to see you Left Forum 2020. And go forth in peace, and let's continue to fight to win. Right on.
Yes.
Hey, thank you guys so much.